I want you to come with me to a place where the world is draped in gray. A place of cold sea mist, black rock, and the pale, unforgiving light of a northern sun. The air smells of salt, wet earth, and wood smoke from a longhouse fire. This is the world of the Vikings, a world we often think we know, a world of long ships, horned helmets which they never wore, by the way, and ferocious, bearded warriors. But tonight we are not going on a raid. We are not sailing for new lands. We are going to a place of judgment, a place of vengeance, a place where poetry and butchery become one. Imagine a captive. He is a king. Perhaps he is Aella, the ruler of Northumbria, the man who, according to legend, murdered the great Viking chieftain Ragnar Lothbrok by casting him into a pit of vipers. Now the tables have turned. Ragnar's sons have conquered his kingdom, and he is their prisoner. He is brought before them, not for a swift execution by the sword or the axe, but for something else entirely, something ceremonial. He is forced to his knees, his back bared to the gray sky and the jeering faces of his captors. There is a hush. This is not a chaotic act of rage. It is a ritual. A man steps forward, holding not an axe, but a long, sharp knife. He is not a clumsy butcher. He moves with a terrible, deliberate artistry. The ritual begins. The blade cuts deep into the skin on either side of the king's spine, tracing the outline of a great bird. The crowd watches, silent now, mesmerized. Then, with an axe or a heavy blade, the executioner begins to sever the ribs from the spinal column, one by one, hacking through bone and sinew. The sound is wet and percussive, a sickening rhythm in the cold air. The ribs, now freed, are pulled outwards, bent back until they crack and splay apart, forming a pair of grotesque, bony wings. The king is still somehow alive. His screams have long since dissolved into choked, gurgling breaths. And then comes the final, horrifying act. The executioner reaches into the newly created cavity, through the shattered cage of the man's own body, and pulls out his lungs, laying them upon his shoulders. The witnesses would see them, slick and pink, still faintly inflating and deflating with the victim's last, fluttering breaths, like the trembling wings of a newly born eagle. This is the blood eagle, the BLRN. It is perhaps the most infamous and gruesome method of execution ever attributed to a historical people. It has become the ultimate symbol of Viking savagery, a story told and retold in books, television shows, and video games. It represents the absolute pinnacle of their cruelty, a terrifying fusion of ritual sacrifice and personal revenge. But what if I told you that this entire horrifying tableau might be a ghost? What if I told you that this defining act of Viking brutality, the ritual that has colored our perception of them for centuries, may never have actually happened? Tonight, we embark on a historical investigation into one of the most contentious and disturbing questions in medieval history. We will become detectives, sifting through the scant, cryptic evidence left behind in ancient Norse sagas and poems. We will weigh the arguments for its reality against the powerful case for it being a dark and enduring myth. Was the blood eagle a genuine Viking ritual, a sacrifice to the god Odin, and a very real fate for their most hated enemies? Or was it a literary invention, a terrible misunderstanding of poetic language, amplified by Christian chroniclers to paint the pagan Northmen as monsters? This is a story about the line between history and legend, between fact and fear. It's a journey that will take us deep into the Viking psyche, into their concepts of honor, revenge, and their relationship with their dark and demanding gods. But it is also a story about our own fascination with violence, and our need to believe in monsters. This is the mystery of the blood eagle, a search for the truth behind the ultimate act of historical horror. To begin our investigation, we must go to the primary sources. We must travel back in time, not just to the Viking Age itself, but to the centuries that followed, to the cold, scholarly scriptoriums of Iceland where the stories of the past were first written down. For this is the first and most crucial fact we must grasp. There are no eyewitness accounts of a blood eagle ritual from the time it was supposedly happening. None. Not a single one. Our evidence comes from much later, from Norse sagas and skaldic poetry, written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, a full 200 to 400 years after the events they purport to describe. This is like trying to write a detailed, factual history of the American Revolution based only on movies and historical novels made today. The potential for distortion, exaggeration, and simple invention is immense. The evidence we do have is scant, cryptic, and maddeningly ambiguous. It amounts to a handful of mentions across a vast body of literature. Let's examine the case files one by one. Our first and most famous alleged victim is Aella, the Anglo-Saxon king of Northumbria. His story is tied to the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok, a figure who himself may be more myth than man. As the legend goes, Ragnar was shipwrecked on the coast of Northumbria in the mid-9th century. King Aella, a devout Christian, captured him and, seeking to make an example of the great pagan warlord, had him executed by throwing him into a pit of venomous snakes. As he died, Ragnar is said to have prophesied that his sons, his cubs, would come to avenge him, and come they did. In 865 AD, a massive Viking force, known in the English chronicles as the Great Heathen Army, landed in England. It was led by Ragnar's sons, including figures like Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. They rampaged across the country, and their ultimate goal was revenge on King Aella. They captured him after the battle for the city of York. Here is where the blood eagle enters the story. Our most graphic description comes from a late 13th century text called Ragnar's Saga Loberkur, or the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. It states, "They caused the bloody eagle to be carved on the back of Aella, and they cut away all of the ribs from the spine, and then they ripped out his lungs." Another text, the A with the Q TTRAF Ragnar Sonum, or the Tale of Ragnar's Sons, gives a similar account. This seems explicit. It's a clear description of the ritual. But remember the source. This is a heroic saga, written 400 years after the fact, designed to Leonize the legendary ancestors of Icelandic chieftains. It's filled with fantastical elements and heroic speeches. Is this a historical record? Or is it a storyteller's dramatic embellishment? A fittingly gruesome end for the man who killed the great Ragnar? Our second major case is that of Halfdan Halleg, or Halfdan Longleg, a son of the first king of a unified Norway, Harald Fairhair. This story comes from the Orkneyinga saga, the saga of the Earls of Orkney, also written in the 13th century. The story goes that Halfdan and his brother Gudrod killed Ragnvald Eysteinn, the Earl of Moor and a close friend of their father, King Harald. In retaliation, Ragnvald's son, the fearsome Einar, also known as Thorfeinar, sailed to Orkney, captured Halfdan, and performed the blood eagle on him. The saga describes it in chillingly poetic terms. Einar composes a verse celebrating his victory, and the prose account adds, "Then Earl Einar went up to Halfdan and carved the eagle on his back in this wise, that he thrust a sword into his breastbone and cut down along the ribs to the loins, and pulled out the lungs through the slits in his back, and gave him to Odin as a victory offering." Here we have another seemingly clear account, and it adds a crucial detail. The victim was given to Odin as a sacrifice. This links the ritual directly to Norse pagan religion, a detail we will return to. But again, we have the same problem. This is a 13th century saga, written by a Christian author. The Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson is a likely candidate, about events from the late 9th century, and Thorfeinar is portrayed as a particularly cruel and unpleasant character. Is this description of the blood eagle a factual account? Or is it a literary device used to characterize Einar as the ultimate, ruthless Viking earl? Beyond these two relatively explicit accounts, the evidence becomes even thinner, more like whispers and echoes. Some scholars have suggested other potential victims, like King Edmund of East Anglia, who was killed by the Great Heathen Army in 869. His later Christian hagiography states that he was whipped, used for target practice by archers, and then beheaded. The Norse sagas, however, offer a slightly different version, with some interpreting the phrase "I cross enum raua" in a red cross as a possible, though highly speculative, reference to a similar type of ritual mutilation. There are also a couple of references in older, more contemporary, but far more poetic sources. A piece of skaldic court poetry from the 11th century, the Nutsdrapa by Sigvatur Rarsson, contains the line, "And Ivar, who in York resided, had Aella's back by an eagle carved," and an even earlier poem, the Rusdrapa, may contain a similar turn of phrase. This poetic evidence is crucial because it's much closer to the Viking Age. But it's also the source of the entire controversy. What does it actually mean to have a back by an eagle carved? Is it a literal description of a gruesome ritual? Or is it something else entirely? A poetic metaphor? A kenning? A kenning is a hallmark of Old Norse poetry, a compound metaphorical expression used in place of a simple noun. A battle sweat is blood. A whale road is the sea. A sword storm is a battle. The language is rich with these powerful, evocative images. Could carving an eagle on someone's back be a kenning? A poetic way of describing a common, if brutal, death. Perhaps it simply meant to be killed in battle and left face down on the field, for the eagles and other carrion birds to come and feed on your back. To have your back torn open by the beaks and talons of an eagle. This would be a deeply shameful end for a warrior, and a fitting, poetic description of total defeat and humiliation. This is the central question of our investigation. Are we dealing with a literal, ritualized execution, or a literary metaphor that was later misunderstood or intentionally dramatized by saga writers hundreds of years later? The paper trail is cold, the clues are ambiguous, and the truth is buried under centuries of storytelling. To find it, we need to look beyond the texts and delve into the world that created them. Let us, for a moment, assume that the saga writers were telling the truth. Let's build the case for the blood eagle as a bloody reality. What would it take for this ritual to be not just a storyteller's fantasy, but a genuine practice of the Viking Age? To believe in the blood eagle, we need to believe in three things: that the Vikings were culturally capable of such an act, that they were religiously motivated to perform it, and that it was, at least in some fashion, physically possible. First, let's consider the cultural context, the Viking mindset. We often have a sanitized, romantic view of the Vikings, but we must not forget that they operated within a brutal honor culture. Their society was governed by concepts that can seem alien to us today. One of the most important was drengskapur, a complex code of conduct encompassing honor, courage, loyalty, and fairness. But the flip side of this honor code was an ironclad system of vengeance. Revenge was not an emotional outburst. It was a social and legal obligation. If a member of your family was wronged or killed, it was your solemn duty to exact retribution. The severity of the revenge was often expected to match or exceed the severity of the original offense. A simple insult might be answered with a duel. The murder of a kinsman demanded a blood feud that could last for generations. Now, consider the case of King Aella and Ragnar Lothbrok. If the story is to be believed, Aella didn't just kill Ragnar. He killed him in a deeply humiliating and dishonorable way in a pit of snakes, a death unfit for a warrior. According to the logic of Viking honor culture, Ragnar's sons were not just entitled to revenge, they were required to seek it. And it couldn't be a simple, clean death. The revenge had to be spectacular. It had to be memorable. It had to be a statement that would be told in stories for centuries to come. A uniquely gruesome, ritualized execution like the blood eagle would fit this cultural logic perfectly. It is the ultimate act of vengeance for the ultimate insult. It restores the family's honor in the most dramatic way imaginable. Second, we must consider the religious motivation. The Orkneyinga saga explicitly states that Halfdan Longleg was given to Odin as a victory offering. This is a crucial link. Odin, the All-Father, was not a gentle or benevolent deity. He was the god of war, of ecstasy, of hidden knowledge, and of death. He was a complex, dark, and often frightening figure. He was the god of the berserkers, the frenzied warriors who fought with a trance-like fury. He demanded sacrifice. While human sacrifice was not an everyday occurrence in the Norse world, it was certainly a known practice, especially in times of crisis or to commemorate a great victory. The 11th century German chronicler Adam of Bremen wrote a famous and likely exaggerated account of the great pagan temple at Uppsala in Sweden, where he claimed every 9 years 9 males of every living creature, including humans, were hanged from the trees of a sacred grove as a sacrifice. Archaeological evidence, such as the discovery of bodies in bogs and wells that show signs of ritual killing, supports the idea that human sacrifice was a part of Norse paganism. A sacrifice to Odin was not just about killing someone. It was about dedicating their death to the god. The method mattered. Hanging was strongly associated with Odin, who famously hanged himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights to gain wisdom. A death by the spear was also an Odinic sacrifice, as Odin himself possessed the great spear Gungnir. Could the blood eagle have been another, more elaborate form of Odinic sacrifice? The eagle was a bird of prey, a symbol of power and a creature associated with the battlefield. Carving a defeated enemy king into the shape of an eagle and offering him to the god of war has a powerful, grim, symbolic resonance. It's a way of saying, Odin, we grant you this great victory, and we give you this enemy, transformed into a symbol of your power. Third, we must confront the grim, practical question. Is it even possible? Could a human being survive such a procedure long enough for it to be completed as described? The modern medical consensus is almost unanimous. No. The victim would die very quickly from a combination of catastrophic blood loss, shock, and, most critically, asphyxiation. The moment the chest cavity is opened and the ribs are splayed, the negative pressure required for the lungs to inflate is lost. The lungs would collapse, a condition known as pneumothorax. The idea of pulling out intact, still breathing lungs and laying them on the victim's shoulders is a physiological impossibility. So, does this kill the theory? Not necessarily. This is where we must think like a Viking, not like a modern surgeon. The purpose of a ritual is not always to achieve a perfect, textbook outcome. The purpose is in the performance. The ritual's power lies in its symbolism and its intent. Perhaps the victim was not expected to survive to the end. The point might have been the process itself. The carving of the eagle outline, the breaking of the ribs, the attempt to pull out the lungs. This act, performed on a still living or recently deceased enemy, would have been an incredibly powerful and terrifying message, both to the victim and to all who witnessed it. The fact that the final, perfect, winged tableau was impossible might have been irrelevant. The horror was in the doing. Furthermore, some have argued for a lesser version of the blood eagle, where the ritual was performed on a corpse shortly after death, or where the cuts were more superficial, a symbolic carving rather than a full-on vivisection. This would solve the physiological problems while retaining the ritual's symbolic power. So, the case for a real blood eagle rests on this tripod of possibilities. A culture of honor and vengeance that demanded spectacular retribution. a dark religion dedicated to a god who accepted human sacrifice, and a gruesome ritual whose symbolic power might have been more important than its practical, physiological execution. When you look at it through this lens, the blood eagle, while still horrifying, begins to look less like a fantasy and more like a plausible, if extreme, product of the violent, faith-driven world of the Vikings. Now, let us flip the coin. Let us put on the cap of the skeptic, the historian, the philologist, and build the case against the blood eagle. This is the position held by the majority of modern scholars, and the evidence supporting it is, in many ways, more compelling than the case for its reality. The argument that the blood eagle is a myth is built on a foundation of literary analysis, historical context, and a deafening silence from the one place where it should be screaming at us, the ground itself. Let's begin by returning to our primary sources, the sagas and poems, but this time, let's read them with a critical eye. As we've established, the most graphic and detailed accounts come from 13th century Icelandic sagas, written hundreds of years after the supposed events. These sagas were not written as objective history. They are historical fiction. They are the Game of Thrones or Vikings of their day, entertainment for a society fascinated by its own heroic pagan past. The authors were Christians, looking back at their heathen ancestors with a mixture of pride and condescension. Their goal was to tell a good story, and a good story needs drama, high stakes, and memorable villains and heroes. Consider the context. A 13th century Christian scholar in Iceland reads, or hears an old, cryptic line of poetry from the Viking age. Ivar had Aela's back by an eagle carved. What does he do with that line? He has two choices. He can interpret it as a poetic metaphor, a kenning for a simple death on the battlefield. Or he can take it literally. The literal interpretation is far more dramatic, far more shocking. It turns a standard act of war into a uniquely monstrous ritual. It makes the pagan Vikings seem both terrifyingly powerful and demonically cruel, a perfect foil for Christian heroes and martyrs. The blood eagle makes for a much better story. This process is called legendary accretion, where a simple story becomes more and more elaborate and fantastical with each retelling. The blood eagle seems to be a textbook example of this, evolving from a vague poetic phrase into a detailed, gory ritual over the course of centuries. The linguistic argument is at the very heart of the case for myth. The Old Norse language of the Skalds was intentionally complex and layered. Kennings were a mark of a poet's skill. To interpret this poetry literally is to fundamentally misunderstand its nature. Let's think about the phrase again. To carve an eagle on the back. The eagle was the ultimate carrion bird of the Norse world, a haunter of battlefields. To be given to the eagle was to die and be devoured. This interpretation is simple, brutal, and fits perfectly within the conventions of skaldic poetry. It requires no leaps of faith, no elaborate physiological explanations. It describes the grim reality of Viking Age warfare in a powerful, poetic way. The myth of the blood eagle, in this view, is born from a simple, tragic misreading. Next, and perhaps most damningly, is the argument from silence. If the blood eagle was a real, established ritual, a significant method of executing enemy kings or offering sacrifices to Odin, we would expect to find some evidence of it. But there is nothing. There is zero archaeological evidence. Archaeologists have excavated countless Viking-age graves and settlements. They have found bodies with sword cuts, axe wounds, and arrow wounds. They have found evidence of decapitations and other forms of violent death. They have found mass graves that attest to the brutality of the era. They have never, not once, found a single skeleton that shows the distinctive pattern of trauma that the blood eagle would inflict the ribs severed from the spine. For a ritual so specific, this complete absence of physical proof is deeply significant. There is also a profound silence in contemporary historical accounts. The Viking Age was not an unrecorded era. In England, monks were writing the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, detailing the invasions of the great heathen army year by year. They described the Vikings as ravening wolves, slaughtering, burning, and looting. They described the martyrdom of King Edmund in great detail. They had every reason to portray the Vikings in the worst possible light. Yet, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written at the time of King Aella's death, says only that the Viking army conquered Northumbria and slew both the kings. That's it. No mention of a horrific eagle-themed torture ritual. Surely, if such an atrocity had occurred, these Christian monks, experts in describing suffering and martyrdom, would have seized upon it as the ultimate proof of pagan devilry. But they say nothing. The silence is deafening. The same is true for other chroniclers across Europe. Frankish, Irish, and Arabic writers all had encounters with the Vikings and wrote about their activities. They described their violence, their trading, and their customs. None of them ever mention the blood eagle. It exists only within the specific, late, and self-contained world of Norse Icelandic literature. This leads us to a final, powerful conclusion. The blood eagle was not a Viking ritual. It was a literary motif. It was a dark fantasy created by later writers who were looking back at a past they no longer fully understood. They took the powerful, metaphorical language of their ancestors and, either through genuine misunderstanding or a deliberate desire to create a more sensational narrative, they literalized it. They built a monster out of a metaphor. The blood eagle, then, tells us very little about the actual religious or judicial practices of the 9th century Vikings. But it tells us a great deal about the 13th century Icelanders who wrote their stories, and about their need to make sense of their own violent and mythic past. So, where does our investigation leave us? We have followed the cold trail of evidence through ancient texts, weighed the cultural arguments, and listened for echoes in the archaeological silence. We are left with two competing narratives. One, a terrifying vision of a real ritual, born from a culture of vengeance and a religion of sacrifice. The other, a compelling case for a literary ghost, a myth born from a misreading of poetry. While we can never know with 100% certainty, the sheer weight of the evidence points overwhelmingly in one direction. The blood eagle was almost certainly not a real, historical practice. The lack of any contemporary or archaeological evidence, combined with the powerful linguistic argument that it was a misunderstood kenning, makes the case for it being a myth almost watertight. The blood eagle is a legend, a brutal, fascinating, and enduring one, but a legend nonetheless. But this conclusion opens up an even more interesting question. If it's not real, why does it have such a powerful hold on our imagination? Why has this particular myth survived and flourished, becoming the definitive symbol of Viking cruelty? The answer, I think, tells us more about ourselves than it does about the Vikings. The blood eagle persists because it is a perfect story. It fulfills a specific need in our collective imagination. We are fascinated by the Vikings because they represent a kind of primal freedom and ferocity that is absent from our modern, regulated lives. We project onto them a fantasy of untamed strength, of a life lived at the sharp edge of existence. And for this fantasy to work, they need to be more than just traders, farmers, and explorers. They need to be monsters. Glorious monsters, perhaps, but monsters all the same. The blood eagle is the ultimate proof of their monstrosity. It validates our perception of them as the ultimate other, a people so savage, so alien, that they could invent a form of cruelty that borders on the divine. The myth also serves a narrative purpose for us, just as it did for the 13th century saga writers. It creates a clear line between us, civilized, modern, and them, barbaric, ancient. It allows us to look back at the past and feel a sense of progress, to reassure ourselves that we have evolved beyond such savagery. But this is a dangerous comfort. By projecting the ultimate barbarism onto a single, probably fictional ritual from a distant past, we can conveniently ignore the methodical, bureaucratic, and all too real cruelties of more recent history. The Blood Eagle is spectacular and theatrical. The real horrors of the 20th and 21st centuries are often quiet, systematic, and far more terrifying in their scale and efficiency. In the end, the story of the Blood Eagle is a powerful lesson in historical skepticism. It teaches us to be critical of our sources, to question who is telling the story and why. It reminds us that history is not a fixed set of facts, but an ongoing process of interpretation, and that the stories we tell about the past are often reflections of our own present-day anxieties, fantasies, and beliefs. The image of the Blood Eagle, the splayed ribs, the fluttering lungs, will likely never lose its power to shock and fascinate. It is a masterpiece of horror. But its true horror may not be that it happened, but that we so desperately want to believe that it did. It is a myth that we have carved onto the back of history, a dark and beautiful lie that speaks volumes about our own unending fascination with the savage heart of the past. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the historical mystery of the Blood Eagle. Exploring these questions, where fact and legend intertwine, is crucial to understanding not just the past, but how we construct our knowledge of it. If this investigation into Viking history, ritual sacrifice, and the nature of myth has intrigued you, please consider supporting the channel. A like, a subscription, and clicking that notification bell helps us continue to explore these forgotten and often misunderstood corners of our history. And now I want to hear from you. After hearing the evidence, do you stand with the skeptics? Or do you believe there might be a kernel of truth to the Blood Eagle? And more importantly, why do you think this particular story continues to fascinate us so deeply? Share your theories, your questions, and your suggestions for future topics in the comments below. The dialogue we have here is the most valuable part of this journey. Thank you for listening.